Poland has just had its closest presidential election first round ever. So literally anything can happen in 2 weeks when Poles actually vote in the second round that is scheduled for June 1st. And given how incredibly nail-biting the contest is set up to be, let's talk about Poland today. As we've explained many times on this channel before, Poland is a country of enormous importance for the future of Europe. So the whole continent, actually including you, should be paying attention to its presidential election whenever it happens, especially so when it is that close. Because whoever wins will actually have decisive influence on the future of Poland, and so by extension on its role in the EU and the entire region. In the first round of the 2025 vote that finished just a few hours ago actually, two very white men, as is often the case in Central Europe, with two very competing visions for Poland's future clashed. The government-affiliated centrist-leaning mayor of Warsaw on the one hand, Rafał Trzaskowski, came on top with around 31.3% of the vote. On the other side of the spectrum and finishing as a very close runner-up, incredibly close that is, with nearly 30% of the vote, we have Mr. Karol Nawrocki, supported by the Conservative Law and Justice Party, which is now in opposition. And because neither of those two was able to get over 50% of the total vote in the first round, things are actually headed into the runoff that I mentioned, scheduled for June 1st. So today, let's take a look at who the two frontrunners actually are, what their visions are for Poland and for Europe, and what factors will actually likely decide the result in 2 weeks' time. Essentially, the question is, will voters be swayed by a vision of a sovereign Poland with less interference by the evil EU, or will a random apartment in the city of Gdańsk will the election for the liberals? You don't know what I mean by that? Well, there's only one thing for you to do. Keep watching to find out more. I'm Jan, this is Prague Pulse, and let's discuss Poland's likely future. But first, as always, thanks to everyone already subscribing to me here on YouTube, and of course, to those of you already supporting me on herohero.co/PraguePulse. And now, let's dive in. If you managed to forget about Poland for a while because, world politics is becoming so much fun everywhere else, congratulations, but here's just a very short reminder of what's actually going on. See, in 2023, Poland actually swapped its conservative government of the Law and Justice Party, or the PiS for short, for a more liberal civic coalition led by Donald Tusk. Remember how hopeful everyone was at the time? Well, yeah. That lasted about as long as Liz Truss's entire premiership in the UK. We've done a successful video on that election, so do watch it for more in-depth context. Now, to oversimplify a bit, Poland has historically been very divided politically, with the more urbanized West voting more liberal, so it would essentially prefer Tusk and his candidates, whereas the rural East votes much more conservative. And so it's a PiS heartland and would support its candidates. And because both those camps have strong support in Poland, candidates from both sides have alternated in power historically. The liberal/conservative division is also very clear in this presidential election. And as we've seen, both candidates from both camps are actually quite popular. Now, why does that even matter, you may ask? Why should you care who wins the presidency in Poland? Isn't Poland, much like the rest of Central Europe and the region, a parliamentary democracy where it's the prime minister and not the president who has the most power? Well, yes and no. See, yes, in the sense that Tusk, the prime minister, is actually the head of government, yes, and it is the government of Donald Tusk which has most responsibility for policy. So that's similar to the rest of the region, correct? However, in Poland, the president actually has one extremely powerful tool that the other presidents in the region do not have, and that is the right to veto, so in other words, block bills passed by parliament. And that veto is incredibly strong. Essentially, the Polish veto is like the ultimate political Uno reverse card. It can block virtually anything unless you somehow manage to find 60%, or if you want, 3/5 of the Polish parliament to overturn the veto, which, given Poland's politics, is just about as easy as convincing Viktor Orbán to wave an EU flag at a pride parade in Budapest. In countries like Czechia or Slovakia, in comparison, a simple majority is enough to overturn a president's veto, so it's much easier for a government to push its agenda through because, a government usually has a simple majority, but it doesn't have a 3/5 majority. That's very, very rare in the region. And that all, of course, makes the Polish president much more powerful, especially so when the president and the prime minister are from the two opposing camps, such as is the case with Donald Tusk and the current Polish president, Andrzej Duda, because the government then won't be able to push any of its agenda through if the president doesn't agree. Rafał Trzaskowski is the current mayor of Warsaw, the capital, and a pro-European liberal-leaning politician, also a deputy leader of Tusk's Civic Coalition, so he is a close ally of the current government. He first rose to national prominence during the 2020 presidential race, so the previous one, where he only narrowly lost to Andrzej Duda, the current president, with 49% of the total vote. So even then, you see that Polish society has really been very fragmented for a long time, and the results tend to be quite close. Unsurprisingly, because he is more liberal, Trzaskowski is mainly popular in large cities in the west of Poland, where the more liberal electorate tends to live. As for his style throughout the campaign, Trzaskowski emphasized healthy common sense in social policy, pro-business reforms, and a pro-Western foreign policy, appealing again to mainly middle-class urban voters and also younger Poles. There, it's important to point out that although he may be liberal, he has been trying to appeal to centrist voters as well, because he knows that in the second round, getting votes from either undecided voters or even some voters from the traditionally conservative camp will be key for him to getting over 50% of the vote and actually becoming president. So he's been trying to come across as more moderate to make that happen. As for law, Trzaskowski has made restoring judicial independence a main thing in his agenda. He supports undoing PIS's controversial court reforms, which we've also talked about on this channel. Do watch that video. And he promises to regain EU trust and therefore unlock frozen EU money that the EU has refused to pay out to Poland because of those controversial steps that the PIS had taken before. Trzaskowski frames himself as a guarantor that Poland will respect constitutional checks and balances and also international norms. And in foreign policy, Trzaskowski is staunchly pro-EU and also, of course, pro-NATO. On the economy, Trzaskowski supports the green transition of the EU because he essentially sees it as a way to gain independence on enemy regimes such as Russia for importing oil and gas and replace it instead by clean energy sources that Poland would produce itself. On social issues, that's where it gets interesting because his approach has been progressive, yes, but very carefully so. For example, he only supports very modest abortion rights reforms and also civil unions for LGBTQ people, which, by the way, in conservative Poland practically makes him the equivalent of a leftist radical, so somewhere around a typical Swedish moderate. See, for context, in Poland, there's actually a nearly total ban on abortions right now, and Trzaskowski would at least like to allow legal abortions for the first 12 weeks of pregnancy, which, by the way, the polls show that over 2/3 of Poles would support. On LGBTQ rights, he says that he wouldn't be opposed to civil unions for gay people, which of course isn't possible either. In the past, he has actually marched in equality demonstrations himself, which is very uncommon for high-ranking politicians in the conservative country. Again, Poland unfortunately consistently ranks as one of the most unfriendly countries in the EU toward LGBTQ people. So this may be actually a hard sell in the more conservative East, where again, Trzaskowski needs at least a few votes to get over that 50% threshold in the second round. Karol Nawrocki, a historian and a PIS-backed candidate, is trying really hard to become the Polish Trump, but of course on a budget, which means less gold-plated towers and more aggressively discounted apartments in Gdańsk. Though not a career politician and officially an independent, Nawrocki has been a trusted figure in PIS's conservative orbit. He previously directed the Museum of World War II in Gdańsk and built a profile as a conservative public servant focused on patriotic topics, which is why the PIS picked him as their candidate in this election. And actually, by selecting him, the PIS likely wanted to present Nawrocki as a fresh face with clean hands and untainted by the day-to-day political life. And the hope was, most likely, that Nawrocki Nawrocki could unite the broadly conservative electorate in the east and bring more voters than a directly PIS-affiliated party member, for example, would be able to. As for messaging, the low-cost Polish Trump even uses a Trumpian slogan, Poland first, to insist that the Polish state must prioritize Poles over foreigners on social services, healthcare, and education. And he also warns that if Trzaskowski wins, because he is a deputy leader of the Civic Coalition, Tusk would be actually the one with absolute power, and Trzaskowski would only be a puppet of the government. And Trzaskowski, for his part, says the very same thing about Nawrocki. He claims that Nawrocki is now a puppet of the PIS and its chief, Jarosław Kaczyński, about whom we've also talked about already. So, the whole thing is quite a mess. Now, on law, Nawrocki has, of course, promised to uphold all the judicial reforms and other reforms enacted by the PIS. He would basically behave the same as the current PIS president, Andrzej Duda. He has a more confrontational stand toward the EU, which also is not surprising to anyone at this point, and he also says that Brussels should not meddle in Poland's internal affairs at all. Of course, what he really means by that is that he wants the EU to continue acting as only a cash cow and not talk about anything else and not impose conditions, which is, of course, not how anything works in the EU. On the economy, Nawrocki promises tax cuts and populist giveaways, such as a 0% tax rate, yes, you heard me, for families with more than 2 children. Instead of the green transition, Nawrocki pledges to expand coal mining with the claim that this will lower electricity bills by a whopping 33%. So again, very similar to Trump and his promise to drill, baby, drill. On social issues, Nawrocki presents himself as a cultural traditionalist, opposing any sort of liberalization of abortion laws. Again, not surprising at all. He has repeatedly attacked LGBTQ people in the campaign and promised to keep what he calls harmful ideologies out of schools. So basically, he is really a Polish Trump with everything you can think of. Ultimately, 3 things will very likely decide the election. First, it will be how much the voters are already pissed off with Tusk's government and how much they will want to punish the government by electing the other party into the presidency. See, in societies that are so fragmented, like the one in Poland, any government's popularity actually falls quicker than the US credit rating right now. Tusk's is definitely no exception to that rule. When his government took power in late 2023, so not that long ago at all, there was even a wave of public optimism, with some people actually expecting a springtime for democracy. Yeah, they were really high on that optimism, right? But that honeymoon phase actually ended very quickly, with multiple polls now showing that the majority of people see the government's performance negatively. I mean, of course, there is no such thing as long-term satisfaction with the government. Nowhere. But the very close result from the first round of this presidential election actually shows us that if one camp somehow manages to piss off some of their voters, and it doesn't have to be too many. You do something slightly wrong, you piss off some people that don't turn up to vote, and you have a problem because the other camp then can very easily win the election by flipping the very close result in its favor. So both sides have to be extra careful right now. Secondly, it could be key whom the other candidates that didn't make it into the runoff and their voters support in the end. It will be especially interesting to watch what the voters of Slawomir Mentzen, the candidate of the far-right Confederation party, do. Mentzen seems to have done better in the first round actually than the polls predicted. He scored above 15% of the total vote, while the latest polls before the vote only predicted around 10% for him. So he did very good. And his 15% could be the deciding factor for the election. But there's a catch. Mentzen's voters are actually notorious for staying home in the runoffs, which means that Nawrocki's best shot at victory now depends on getting voters who by definition dislike everyone and everything, which is why they vote for the Confederation, to suddenly like him instead and turn up to vote. Which, good luck. But the biggest wildcard and probably the deciding factor of the election might very well be Nawrocki's recent apartment scandal that leaked to the media. Very briefly, Nawrocki got a suspiciously cheap apartment at 90% off in the city of Gdańsk from an elderly man referred to simply as Pan Jerzy. in the media. And that man was then conveniently moved to a nursing home so as to make space in that apartment for Nawrocki. Now, of course, Nawrocki and his campaign insist that everything was perfectly legal and moral, and that he was actually taking care of Jerzy, and that's why he got the apartment in the first place. But then again, of course, Nixon, for example, also claimed that everything he did was fine, and we know that it very much wasn't. Plus, let's face it, nothing says candidate of the common people, which is how the PIS tried to portray Nawrocki, quite like acquiring real estate at 90% off from senior citizens. So what happens next? Will Polish voters punish Tusk's government faster than Elon Musk has ruined Twitter? Sorry, X. Can Nawrocki survive his apartment saga? Or will voters finally decide that exploiting the elderly is, maybe not great for a national leader? Which camp will win this time? And how will the new president impact the success of Tusk's government in pushing its agenda? Will he use the veto extensively or not? We don't know, but we do know one thing. Given how incredibly tight the election is, Polish politics is about as predictable right now as the stability of any Italian government at any given time, which is to say, not at all. If you enjoyed this video, and statistically 80% of you have and are still watching but without subscribing, please click that button and subscribe. I promise you it's quicker, easier, and far more rewarding than finding a suspiciously cheap place in Gdańsk. And to those of you already supporting me on herohero.co/PraguePulse, you are the reason I can keep covering Central European politics without actually having to resort to shady real estate deals. So thank you. I'm Jan, and this has been Prague Pulse. See you soon.